Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the ICC's Make Climate Action Everyone's Business Forum, which is helping organisations to improve their sustainability agenda, to move away from good intentions to meaningful results. My name's Shiulie Ghosh. I'm a journalist by trade, and I think, as everyone here knows, there's been a lot of focus in the media recently around the science around climate change. And I think the science is very clear. One scientific report after another warning with growing urgency that the world is very much at a tipping point and the time for action is now. Now, I think this is something that leaders and decision makers are increasingly recognizing across the spectrum, from rural communities to captains of industry to some of the world's richest nations. There is a growing recognition and a growing call for change. I think the problem is we know something has to be done, but what is it we need to do? What are the best practical steps? One of the stumbling blocks is that there's often a lack of consensus on what it is that we need to aim for. What is the best approach to decarbonisation? What commitments do we need to make? What actually do we mean by net zero? And this confusion often leads to organisations and bodies being unsure of what are the best steps to take. So one of the proposed solutions is the transformation of climate commitment into meaningful action through internationally agreed standards. And that's what we're going to be discussing over the next 30 minutes or so. The invaluable support that standards can bring to the global climate agenda. And I'm pleased to say that we have an expert to take us through the finer points of this. I'm glad to introduce to you Noelia Garcia Nebra. She is the head of sustainability at ISO, the world's best known standards organization. Noelia, great to have you here with me.
Thank you, Shiulie. Great being with you today here.
Now, look, you heard me mention earlier that there is a little uncertainty over the best approach when it comes to climate change. Some of the language that's used is a little woolly. When it comes to the concept of net zero, is there a globally agreed definition?
It is indeed a concept that is widely spread, but is sometimes used to mean different things. Some people mean decarbonization, some people use the concept of net zero to talk about carbon neutrality. So it is indeed necessary that we agree on a globally consensus-based definition. That's the only way that we can ensure that climate commitments are credible and they are comparable. Having a clear common definition is going to be the first step to ensure that the proliferation of climate commitments that we are seeing today are going to be credible, accountable, and measurable. So some work to be done there.
So if we're all on the same page, if we all have the same agreed definition of what net zero is, then it should be, in theory, easier to put in place a common approach.
Indeed, that's going to be the very first step to make sure that we are all moving towards the same goal, the same objective, and to make sure that organizations are on the same path.
And to this end, ISO is launching its net zero guidelines. It's launching them at COP27 on what has been designated as Decarbonisation Day, November the 11th. Now, tell us about the net zero guidelines. What does that bring to the climate change agenda?
The net zero guidelines are the result of a big multi-stakeholder effort. It has been developed thanks to the contribution of more than 1,000 people and organizations. The net zero guidelines, what they aim is at clarifying the concept of net zero. We just mentioned that sometimes is used to mean different things. So through the guidelines, we expect to bring clarity on the concept of net zero, what this concept means for different types and sizes of organizations, and offer recommendations on how to introduce net zero into strategies and policies. It is important to highlight that the net zero guidelines introduce the principle of equity and justice, whereby organizations, they need to consider the need to balance actions towards net zero with the need to protect the communities, the society, and the economy, which is in line with what is said by the Paris Agreement.
And I assume that if you have guidelines which are recognized and internationally agreed, it makes measuring progress easier as well.
Indeed. So the guidelines will also provide some measures for accountability and measurement of initiatives, therefore facilitating what we were just mentioning, the comparability of actions taken by different organizations.
Now, we've talked about this before when it comes to climate change. A lot of companies and organizations say they're doing something, but because there isn't a sort of agreed measures on measuring progress, it's easy to make commitments which actually don't mean anything. And I think with woolly definitions, you get this issue of so-called greenwashing. I think people are very wary of that, about claims being made which aren't being fulfilled and don't mean anything anyway. Do globally agreed standards help prevent that?
Yes, international standards, they laid a solid foundation for global climate actions. They help bringing coherence. They help setting international benchmarks, which are going to help measuring the impact of global efforts. Is by setting common terminology and definitions that we will be able to bring coherence to this space and bring transparency to the actions that organizations and countries as well are putting in place. They facilitate the communication and the comparison of actions and activities being put in place. ISO has many international standards in their portfolio that can support those efforts, and together all these standards form a system that can be assessed and certified by independent bodies, and this is very important if we want to prevent greenwashing. And I invite everyone interested to visit us. Sorry.
It's going to make it harder for companies to make superficial claims.
Exactly, because when you have specific definitions of what we mean by those targets and what we mean by the measures that we are putting in place, it's much more difficult to hide any greenwashing attempts.
I mean, hearing you talk about it, you're clearly very passionate about bringing changes to the climate agenda. I know ISO has been very vocal in this, in promoting how standards support the green transition. Do you think companies and decision makers fully understand how standards can help with things like, the nuts and bolts of the green transition, things like sustainable financing, green technology in the path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
I think overall decision makers and organizations understand that international standards are catalysts of best practices and are important tools for harmonizing methods and processes. The role of international standards in support of sustainable goals has been widely recognized by many organizations and by the international community. International standards such as ISO 14001 environmental management systems is being used by hundreds of thousands of companies in many different sectors and around the world. The UN Secretary General in COP26 recognized the importance of international standards to measure and analyze climate commitment. So I think there is a recognition of the importance of international standards in this area. Maybe the challenge or the difficulty is actually moving into action. Like the actual implementation might sometimes seem a bit complex and it requires real commitment. And that's where ISO, together with our members in 165 countries, we are here to support stakeholders, any party interested in implementing international standards.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things that we talk about a lot, that we have seen a multitude of pledges and commitments made by countries, by businesses, to reach those goals that have been set at international level, COP26, Paris Agreement, so on and so forth. How can ISO and national standards bodies really support national and international climate policies?
Standards development and the regulatory process, actually, they share many principles, many core value and principles. The regulatory coherence and cooperation is key to achieve climate outcomes. And as I said it before, international standards, they bring coherence and they are based on cooperation. So therefore, you can see already that these are two tools that can really work together. I think it's important also to explain, though, that even if they are two tools that can work together, they are different in nature. Regulations are legislative tools, and the compliance is mandatory, and they are adopted by authorities. International standards, they are voluntary measures, so they are not mandatory by nature, except if they are referred in regulations, of course. And they are approved by a recognized body, which are the national standards bodies. The national standards body are ISO members. So ISO and our national standards bodies that are our members create a network of standardizers that understand the national and regional context. And they can help through international standards supporting public policy objectives at the national level. Let me give you an example. For example, our member in Colombia, eContact, works very closely with the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in defining the environmental criteria that form what is called the Colombian Environmental Mark. Also in the UK, the British Standards Institute have been working closely with the UK government and in a multi-stakeholder approach to support the government's ambition to decarbonize the transportation system by 2050. We also collaborate a lot with international and regional organizations such as CENELEC that supports the European standardization strategy, or with COPAN, which is the group of national standards body in the Americas.
So what you're saying is that standards are a mechanism to fulfill regulations. So they're an important mechanism in that. Do you think there is a case, though, for a different approach in low-income countries? They have different economic considerations, they have different starting points. Do you think they should have different standards set for them?
I think international standards should be the same for everyone. That's why they are international, right? They should be globally applicable. What for me it's important is really to make sure that low-income countries are at the table. They are an active participant in the standards development processes. We need to empower them to contribute to the international standardization system, and we have to support them in promoting the use of international standards within their national context. So, yeah, international standards should be the same for everyone, but we need to make sure to hear the voices of developing countries, understand their needs, so that the solutions that we are developing are adapted to them. We also, of course, need to make sure that they also bring new topics for international standardization that are important in their national context.
So ISO offers assistance to low middle income countries in terms of meeting those international standards and setting those international standards?
Supporting our members in low-income countries is a core value of ISO, is a key priority of our strategy 2030. We have a committee that looks into the specific matters of developing countries, of low-income countries, and we provide capacity building assistance to our members. In those countries to do exactly what I was saying, to help them be an efficient participant in international standardization and to help them use international standards to support the national sustainable goals.
So you've talked a little bit about the assistance that ISO gives to members, member organizations, national standardization bodies in developing those standards. What kind of resources do you make available to help them?
We provide them with different training guides, expertise, consultancy services to help them develop and implement best practices, what we call good standardization practices, develop national standardization strategies that are aligned with the country's development strategy, promote standards and the value of standards among stakeholders, working with the governments on how international standards can support public policies, and also working with the private sector in the implementation of standards. One very interesting example is the project we had in the MENA region, which is the region hosting to us at COP this year, where we work with our national standards bodies and private sector to implement environmental standards and standards to support energy efficient, where we saw important reductions in energy consumption, for example, and the increase of environmental practices within the private sector that were part of that project.
I mean, some of the work you're doing is really exciting, and I know that all your new and revised standards are all now aligned to the global climate agenda, and that is something that ISO and all its member bodies are fully committed to, and that was demonstrated by the adoption of the London Declaration a year ago. Tell us about that. What is the ethos behind that?
ISO's climate commitment is firm and ambitious. We have been working on sustainability and supporting climate action for many years. I mentioned before ISO 14001, which is very well known. That's a standard that was developed in 1996. Our work related to standardization and calculation of emissions of GHG was launched in 2007. So we have been working in that space for many years. But last year, with the London Declaration, our members wanted to really publicly commit to support the global action in the space and join forces. What are our commitments? The first one is to make sure that we foster the consideration of climate science in all the standards that we develop. We have a portfolio of standards directly linked to environment, but we want to make sure that this climate lens is brought to everything we do. I mean, even for standards on oil and gas, they should also consider climate aspects. And our second important commitment is making sure that civil society and those more vulnerable to climate are at the table, are part of the discussions, and they are involved in the development of international standards. That's the only way to make sure that the solutions we are developing are adapted to the needs of everyone.
Yeah, so everything going hand in hand with environmental considerations. What has it meant in practice? What are your member organizations doing? What changes are they trying to push?
There are a lot of efforts going on at the national level and also at the international level. There is a big effort on stakeholder engagement, as I mentioned before, to have everyone around the table to work with policymakers. For example, our member in South Africa, SAPS, has recently been doing a lot of work with their Ministry of Trade to develop a national plan against plastic pollution and what will be the role of international standards in that context. Or we have our member, for example, in Standards Australia, that's working closely with Fiji in developing standards for climate adaptation. So standards on wind loading to support to ensure that buildings are more resilient in view of the increasing occurrence of cyclones. So big effort at the national level to involve everyone and to make sure, as I was saying before, that the standards are developed thinking about what is the climate impact that standard will have once it is implemented.
And it's fascinating because it's across every sector, every industry that you can think of, the building industry, the agricultural industry, you have a standard for every sector, it seems, and all of that is now going to be done with a view to limiting the impact on the climate.
Exactly. We want to make sure that our experts that develop the standards, that form the committees, understand the power that international standards have in supporting climate action, and therefore they should consider those impacts and how can we support any sector, and particularly those probably that are the most polluting sectors and those that can have a bigger impact if something is changed.
We know that more and more businesses are looking at their operations this way. More businesses are incorporating the ESG framework into their strategy. That is a way of making themselves accountable for, how they impact on the environment and on society. How do international standards help companies meet those targets and deliver their ESG reports with confidence?
So the ESG frameworks support organizations, as you were saying, their efforts to disclose data and the impact of their activities, as you were saying, in the environment and in society and in governance. These criteria is becoming more and more important in guiding investment decisions. However, companies disclosing this data and this impact, they also need methodology standards such as ISO standards, because those standards are the ones that will help them implement efficient processes and help them verify and validate their claims. ISO has an existing portfolio of ESG methodology standards, both technical and management system standards, which are ready to use and to deploy by those organizations. But let me give you an example on how they can work together. So any company disclosing their ESG activities might be required, for example, to say how or to disclose data on their energy efficiency, for example. So this company, if they implement ISO 15001 energy management systems, this company will be able to develop a policy for a more efficient use of energy, make decisions about what kind of energy to use, fix targets and objectives that will help them improve in their ESG score. So that's how ESG disclosure standards and methodology standards can work together and supporting the companies in their claims and in their activities.
You mentioned a very important word there, investors. And I think a lot of sustainability strategies are being driven by investor demands, by consumer demands, and also by those communities where the impact of climate change is most felt. How do we make sure that we listen to those voices and that those voices are heard?
Definitely having the voice of the consumer is vital if we want to develop solutions that make sense and that can be implemented and used. Actually, I always remember this example of cook stoves, right? Cook stoves in many developing countries in particular can be a big source of health issues in households because of the toxic fumes that they produce. And there was this important move to develop clean cook stoves for those households, but the problem was they didn't talk and they didn't consult the people that use cook stoves in developing countries, right, resulting on, yes, a more clean solution, but a solution that no one actually used because it took more time to cook. Mainly they are women and they didn't have the power to decide, or like they don't have the economic power in many of the economic decision in developing countries. So I think this is a very clear example of you need to talk to the final user. So here we have the consumers, right? We need to listen to them and understand what do they need to make sure that those solutions are actually being implemented.
Because the standards have to be user-friendly at the end of the day. And if you don't listen to the people that they impact on directly, you could come up with the entirely wrong solution.
Correct. And that's the importance of having a multi-stakeholder process for develop international standards where every voice is heard. In ISO, we work with consumers and consumer representatives for many years. We have a committee that looks into consumer matters. And actually, we have a number of international standards that have been developed thanks to the original need of consumers. One of the recent examples is actually standards on menstrual products that are going to be looking also at the environmental impact of menstrual products as well. And this is something that comes actually from the consumer voices.
And it's important to make sure that you have a diverse range of voices. You talked about menstrual products there. So clearly we have to listen to women's voices. We have to listen to voices from across all the sectors.
Absolutely. The importance of diversity and inclusion in everything we do is really a key. ISO is a signatory of the UNEC Declaration for Gender Responsive Standards, and we have been working hard for many years in bringing this gender lens to our work and making sure that we develop gender responsive standards and that we have more women at the table.
Yeah, because they are very often some of the biggest affected groups by climate change. We've talked about listening to consumer voices, Noelia, but there's a whole raft of stakeholders involved when it comes to the climate agenda. And one of the things that ISO is very strong on is collaborative efforts, partnerships. How does ISO inspire effective cooperation? What is needed?
The first thing is we recognize that we are not alone. And again, we cannot develop international relevant standards without hearing everyone that is going to be impacted by that. So we know we are part of a multilateral system and a system that needs to have everyone at the table. We work with many organizations, regional, international, national. NGOs are also involved in the development of international standards as well. ISO is committed together with its members to work with all stakeholders and partners and bringing them to the table. We want to listen to them. We want to understand what they need so that, again, we develop international standards that are needed. It's only like that we will make sure that we will be able to achieve the Paris Agreement, to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and that we will contribute to the United Nations call for action and on adaptation and resilience. Collaboration has been always been at the heart of everything that we do. We have always used an inclusive approach to developing international standards, because only by involving everyone, including those more vulnerable to climate, we can help build a better future. A recent experience of collaboration is our 2050 Wall Initiative, which is a global collaboration between ISO, the UN Race to Zero, and the UNFCCC that was launched at COP26 last year in Glasgow, with the aim to accelerate the global journey to climate to net zero through standards. And the very first outcome of that initiative is actually the net zero guidelines I mentioned before. So we are ready to discuss, to work with everyone. That's why we are at COP27. We want to hear from our partners from the international community, from civil society, and we want to exchange with them to understand what other solutions are still needed in that space.
Yes, so I was going to reiterate, this is something that ISO very much wants to do. It wants to collaborate. It wants to work with stakeholders. It wants to work with industries and companies and NGOs and civil society and consumers, so it can extend the number of climate aligned standards that it has on offer. So we really want to stress that. Can I ask you a personal question, Noelia? You've been involved in this sphere for some time now. It's something that you're very vocal about. When you look at the changes that we've seen since COP26, are you encouraged by the progress, or do you still get frustrated by the speed of things and how far we still have to go and what we still have to do?
I think it's a bit of a mixed feeling. I think it's nice to see that there is more global awareness of the importance of climate change, of the impact that we are having. I think we have all experienced that, at least in the Northern Hemisphere this summer. And we have seen some actions. We have seen an increase of countries setting targets for 2030 through their national determined contributions. But then, on the other hand, as you were saying, maybe we are not at the speed that is required. I think at that level there is still a lot to be done. We need to make sure that commitments become or are translated in real action. We need to make sure that financing is available for those more vulnerable, for countries in low-income countries, so that they can also contribute to global efforts. So a mixed feeling. I still believe on the power of collaboration, of bringing everyone together. It can be also a small individual action. It can be a bigger collaborative initiative. I think if everyone puts a little bit in the plate, we will manage.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think it is a very mixed bag, but I know that we can do better as a world. I want to get a final thought from you then on what kind of value you believe ISO offers to the climate agenda.
ISO and its members are clearly committed to aligning international standards with climate action and to work with those that are most impacted by it. What ISO offers is an open and inclusive platform that facilitates cross-sectoral partnerships so that we ensure the development of globally relevant standards. These partnerships can be the key to unleash innovative solutions and to bring the real transformation that we need to achieve the world that we are all envisaging.
Noelia, it's been great to speak with you and to hear how better collaboration with stakeholders is something that ISO can use to reduce the impact on the climate agenda. Thank you very much indeed for speaking with me. And to everyone who's been watching this interview, you can find out more about ISO's work and resources available on its website. That's iso.org. Better still, if you are at COP27, you can drop in and meet the team. They are in the green and blue zone, and I know that they would love to see you. Noelia Garcia Nebra, thank you once again. Thank you to everyone who's watching. Have a great day.